stone walls towering high, drawbridges creaking in the mist, and brave knights defending the realm. Castles hold tales of valor and villainy, but not everything is as it seems. From tricky moats to hidden passages, let's uncover the myths and misconceptions that shroud these ancient fortresses. Here are the most common castle misconceptions. First up on our list are castle toilets, known as garderobes or latrines, weren't as filthy as you might think. They featured a plank of wood with a hole, supported by stone, through which waste was deposited. Located on the coldest northern walls of the first floor, often at a corner edge and far from the entrance, waste would drop down a cavity in the wall to the ground below. Some castles had chutes to channel the waste more discreetly. Though hygiene wasn't up to modern standards, castles were relatively clean. Floors were swept, rubbish had designated areas, and coverings were used when needed. The garderobes weren't cesspools of filth, as myths suggest. You've probably heard the story, castle staircases always spiral clockwise to give right-handed defenders an advantage. But this notion, despite its appealing logic, is based more on speculation than fact. A study by the Castle Studies Group reveals over 85 examples of counterclockwise newel staircases in English and Welsh castles from the 1070s to the 1500s. While such staircases were less common in Norman-era castles, their prevalence grew significantly from the 1240s onwards, especially in Edwardian castles of the late 13th century and beyond. So next time you're exploring ancient stone corridors and winding stairwells, remember that not all staircases conform to the myth of clockwise defense. In fact, counterclockwise staircases are more common than you might think. Another common misconception is that all castles are made entirely of stone. While the towering stone keeps and battlements that have survived into the modern age certainly reinforce this belief, it's far from the full story. In reality, the earliest castles were predominantly built of wood, often in the form of motte and bailey structures. These wooden fortifications provided quick and practical defense, but were susceptible to decay and fire, leaving few traces for historians today. Take York Castle, for instance. Its original wooden keep stood until 1190, and the stone replacement wasn't completed until the end of the 13th century, a clear indication of how long and costly it was to build in stone. Even stone castles had wooden elements, like floors and roofing, that have long since rotted away. As technology advanced, many wooden motte and bailey castles were replaced by stone keeps. But wood remained crucial for constructing upper floors, palisades, and defensive features. So, while stone eventually became the symbol of medieval fortification, the role of wood shouldn't be overlooked. Look at any castle today, and you'll see nothing but bare stone walls. But this grey, stark image is far from the colourful reality of the Middle Ages. Castle rooms weren't the empty shells they appear to us now. If a castle was home to a noble family, you can bet it would have been lavishly adorned with carved wood furniture, wall tapestries, and elaborate rugs. Walls weren't bare either. They were often covered in smooth white plaster, painted in bright reds, yellows, and blues. Lords didn't worry about walls crumbling because cannons hadn't been invented yet, so they used plaster freely. Over time, this delicate material faded or crumbled away, leaving us with only the cold stone surfaces we see now. But if you look closely at some medieval walls, you might still find traces of plaster clinging to the ancient stone. With their grand halls and elaborate decorations, it's easy to see why people think castles were all owned by knights. But many castles were actually owned by the crown, positioned in strategically important areas rather than as places to call home. These castles weren't empty, though. The king would appoint a castellan, a trusted military officer who didn't necessarily have to be of noble birth, to hold the castle in his name. One of the best jobs a low-born man could aspire to was the position of a royal castellan, making him a lord in all but name. In Wales, where castles often included luxurious private quarters, the role of castellan was a highly coveted dream for many. So, while knights certainly lived in and owned castles, the reality is that many were royal fortresses, managed by officers entrusted with defending the realm. Think lords could build castles wherever they pleased? Think again. Thanks to William the Conqueror's insistence on complete control over England, all castles were technically property of the king. Even nobles only rented their lands from the crown, making it easy for the monarch to reclaim property as needed. A new castle was a potential threat to the king, so the English crown established a law requiring lords to obtain a license to crenellate before fortifying a residence. Like applying for a building permit today, nobles had to seek royal approval before erecting a new stronghold. The monarch issued only a handful of these licenses, and the process was anything but easy. Even with a license, the castle didn't truly belong to the lord who built it. Instead, it remained the king's property, reinforcing royal authority and preventing ambitious nobles from building fortresses at will. So, while lords may have dreamed of castles on every hilltop, the reality was a lot more complicated. When we think of castles, we often imagine them surrounded by moats filled with water. While some moated castles exist, many are faux medieval mansions built later. In reality, water-filled moats were impractical and rare, often making castles easier to attack. Dry moats, wide ditches without water, were more common and effective, keeping siege equipment at bay. Most castles relied on high ground and natural barriers for defense, with dry moats supplementing natural features. Harlech Castle, perched on a rocky outcrop, has a deep ditch on its exposed side, while Warwick Castle uses a wide ditch to guard vulnerable areas. Despite their fairy tale image, water-filled moats weren't common in medieval castles. Strategic location and dry ditches were the real keys to their defense. One of the most persistent misconceptions about castles is that they all had dungeons hidden beneath them. In reality, the term donjon in Old French meant great tower, not an underground prison. In medieval times, captives were usually wealthy prisoners held for ransom, not common criminals. Prisoners were sometimes kept on the lowest floor of towers, often in windowless rooms. So, while dungeons existed, they weren't as widespread or hidden beneath castles as popular imagination suggests. The idea of the underground dungeon came later, shaped more by fiction than historical reality. A common misconception about medieval society is that social mobility was non-existent, with peasants remaining peasants and nobles staying nobles. While this is largely true, it's often believed that people of different social classes shared the same space, sometimes even sleeping in the same hall within castles. In reality, castles were highly stratified places. Both Conwy and Chepstow castles, for instance, had inner courtyards exclusively reserved for the monarch's use. These courtyards would be empty when the king wasn't in residence, emphasizing the separation of social classes. At Harlech Castle, the entire upper floor of the gatehouse was solely for the king or castellan, offering a private residence. Moreover, these high-ranking individuals had their own space with more fireplaces than any other living quarters in the castle. So, while it might appear that everyone shared the same hall, lords, castellans and kings often had their own distinct living quarters, separated from the common folk. It's often believed that castles were perpetually cold, drafty places, but the reality is more nuanced. While it's true that stone castles were poor insulators and often built in elevated locations, fireplaces were a common feature, and not just for the lords and kings. Most castles had multiple fireplaces to keep the chill at bay. Modern visitors often find castles colder than they would have been in medieval times because the fireplaces are unlit and the rooms empty. When occupied, the great halls were filled with warmth from roaring fires burning all day and the body heat of dozens of people. Additionally, the fireplaces themselves were much larger than those found in today's homes. Narrow windows and thick stone walls helped retain the heat, making the Great Hall surprisingly cozy during gatherings. An evening spent in a packed hall with a massive fire crackling would have been far warmer than we imagine today. Moving on from the misconception that castles were cold, it's easy to see why the Great Hall was considered the heart of the castle. While many people think it was only used for feasts, it was actually a multifunctional space. Councils were held there, meals were eaten, music was enjoyed, and in some castles, it served as the sleeping quarters for nearly everyone. Interestingly, most castles lacked barracks. Soldiers and staff who lived in the castle daily often slept in the Great Hall unless a large garrison was required. In that case, tents would be set up outside the castle, but this was not the norm. Thus, the Great Hall wasn't just for feasting. It was a vibrant, multifunctional hub of activity and community within the castle walls. Another common misconception about castles is that they were always heavily guarded with large garrisons. In reality, most castles were not nearly as well garrisoned as one might expect. Even the most fortified castles, such as those along the Welsh and Scottish borders, typically housed only around 200 men at a time. Many castles served primarily as private residences, with only those on the borders prepared for an attack. In some cases, castles could accommodate a few dozen soldiers, but it wasn't unusual for them to have none at all. Large garrisons would have required significant resources in terms of food and space, which would have been wasteful in times of peace. Therefore, most castles opted for minimal staffing, relying on strategic location and defensive design instead. Castles loom large in our minds, but many myths hide their true nature. They weren't cold, lifeless places, and their dungeons weren't always underground prisons. Most had small guards and relied on good locations rather than moats. The Great Hall wasn't just for feasting, it was the heart of castle life. Clearing up these myths helps us see the real stories behind these ancient fortresses. As always, thanks for watching. Certainly don't forget to like, comment, and perhaps subscribe if you really want some more of that history crack.